How are you actually doing, though? A study identifying how poverty should be measured by Dagny Tombaugh and Gina Rabello. So to begin with defining poverty, we asked AI how it defined poverty in one sentence. When we put that in, the answer we got was, poverty is the condition of lacking sufficient financial resources and essential services to meet basic needs and achieve a standard of living considered acceptable within a given society. Moreover, when we ask ourselves about the definition, we also have to ask ourselves about the measurement of poverty. So, how does AI measure poverty in one sentence? AI measures poverty by assessing income levels against a threshold of minimum needs or standard, and may also include evaluating access to essential services and overall living conditions. So, what does the average American think of when they think of poverty? For most, what comes to mind is a homeless person or somebody that doesn't have enough income to provide for their family. But according to Robert Rector, he argues that the average American often thinks that the word poverty implies significant material deprivation, an inability to provide a family with adequate nutritious food, reasonable shelter, and clothing. And while this is true, many Americans do think of the stereotypical poverty. Our goal is to change these perceptions and prove that poverty is more than just a material lack, but one of intangible values such as inclusion, dignity, and self-worth, rather than saying one doesn't simply have enough income.
One way to step away from the typical idea of poverty is to incorporate Nussbaum's capability approach. Nussbaum's capability approach is crucial to understanding how we can create a better measurement of poverty. Her approach is based on the idea of functionings, which is beings and doings, aka what you're able to be, what you're able to do, what are you capable of, which translates into capabilities. These are the possible combinations of being and doings. To put this into context, for example, you might have the functioning of money because you work a job and you have purchasing power. However, you might live in a food desert, which means that it's difficult to access farms or grocery stores. So it's difficult for you to get food that provides you high quality nutrients, which in turn harms your physical well-being and your dignity as a human. We need to consider more than simply monetary resources in assessing poverty, and Nussbaum's approach allows us to do this by encouraging us to assess what people are actually able to do and be in order to see what kind of quality of life they have and how they're maintaining their human dignity.
So, how do we as a group define and measure poverty? First off, we define poverty as the condition of not having real opportunities for a dignified life. And you may be asking yourself, what are opportunities? Opportunities are the capabilities to do things and achieve certain goals. For our measurement, we decided that by modifying the SPM to include assessments on education and nutritious food especially, we can create a more universally inclusive understanding of poverty for an individual person or household. So we are moving away from the typical, how much money do you have, and rather, how much access do you have to education and food in order to include other people.
One way that the U.S. government has found to try and measure poverty is the official poverty measure. It measures resources such as untaxed gross annual cash income, government cash benefits, and it considers the income of a family connected by legal documents such as marriage, birth, or adoption. The threshold for the OPM is 3 times a thrifty food basket. This is because this measurement was created in the 1960s, and they took the information from the Agriculture Department that led them to understand that Americans were spending 1/3 of their income on food. So they multiplied this amount by 3 to get how much their annual income was. They adjust this threshold each year for inflation and for the amount of people within a household, so that you know how many mouths you have to feed. So what does the OPM look like when it's actually being used? Let's consider this example. Steve is a 62-year-old man who makes $15,000 a year. He lives alone, and he has the added benefit of $9,000 a year in Social Security. If the poverty line is $15,000, then Steve is above the poverty line according to the OPM. Bob, on the other hand, makes $15,000 a year. He lives alone and he's 35 years old. So according to the OPM, he's living at the poverty line. Since the creation of the OPM, things have changed pretty substantially. Families no longer spend 1/3 of their income on groceries, and the government now supplies a lot more different aid programs that don't necessarily cover cash benefits. Because of this, the SPM was created, or the Supplemental Poverty Measure, to measure more realistically what people's incomes look like from year to year. The resources counted by the SPM include the usual untaxed gross annual income and government cash benefits, but it also moves to include non-cash government benefits, or in-kind or near cash. And to this, it subtracts the non-discretionary expenses of day-to-day life, such as transport, out-of-pocket health care, and taxes. The threshold for the SPM is 83% of the cost of food, clothes, shelter, and utilities, multiplied by 1.2. This is adjusted for cohabitors rather than people only tied to you by law, because people now live in different familial situations, or even with people who aren't their family but affect their annual household income. It is also adjusted for inflation year to year and adjusted for different geographic regions across the U.S. Now that we understand what the SPM is, we can apply it to Steve and Bob's situations. Steve also spends $6,000 a year on diabetes medication and other important medical expenses that he can't live without. He also spends about $2,000 a year on transportation because he has constant car troubles and his county doesn't have local transportation. Bob, which we couldn't see before, actually lives with his girlfriend and her 7-year-old daughter. His family situation looks much more different using the SPM. Furthermore, he also receives $9,000 a year from the SNAP program, which makes him now above the poverty line, and Steve just barely above it. So we can see the SPM allows us to get a much fuller picture of what someone's financial situation looks like. What makes the SPM better than the OPM for measuring the monetary aspects of poverty, in our opinion, is that the SPM gives a broader definition of income, and this allows us to get a better understanding of what the true financial standing of a household is. It also deducts essential expenses that gives a realistic idea of what families are spending to meet their basic needs. Finally, the SPM creates more modern thresholds and understandings for determining poverty, and it allows us to understand how well the government economic programs are working to actually get people out of poverty. So if the SPM is so great and so much better than the OPM, then why not just take that and run with it? Well, we also want to consider how people are able to take their monetary abilities and their actual living conditions and capabilities and turn that into present and future opportunities so that we can really assess the likelihood of someone to continue to have a greater quality of life rather than continue and live in poverty, or the likelihood of them returning to poverty in the future.
So Steve and Bob, how are you actually doing though? Here are some common ways that Steve and Bob's capabilities could actually be measured. The World Bank uses reading proficiency tests to measure educational inequalities around the world, is the first example. And also Feeding America measures food insecurity by calculating how many individuals are above and below the SNAP threshold in countries across the U.S.
These kind of measurements allow us to get a fuller grasp on Steve and Bob's capabilities, and they're ways that are actively and feasibly being done in the world right now. We don't have an exact answer as to how we should measure somebody's capability to access good food and to access a proper or what is enough education, but these are great starting points. We want to know how close they live to a farm, how close they live to a grocery store, what's the quality of food in these areas? Is it something that is going to be enough nutrients to sustain them throughout the day? And as far as schooling, where is the nearest school? How long are they able to attend it? How much is enough school to say that they have a good education that could lead them to have the opportunity or capability to fulfill anything that they would want in the future? These aren't easy questions to answer, but they're important. And when we look at poverty, we have to look past just the monetary aspect to truly measure and define what someone is going through when they're living in poverty, how we can maintain their human dignity no matter what their income level is, and how we can help to remove the barriers that poverty creates for people in the U.S. and around the world.